Good evening and thanks for joining us. On the day world leaders gathered in Egypt for the COP27 climate change talks, this was happening here in the capital. Protests by climate activists bringing parts of the M25 in London, Surrey and Kent to a standstill. The group Just Stop Oil went ahead with planned action to target the motorway despite efforts by the Met overnight to foil their plans. Here's our environment correspondent, Tom Edwards.
The country's busiest motorway, the M25, again at a standstill. This morning, environmental protesters Just Stop Oil took to the gantries over the motorway. They want all new gas and oil licences halted and posted this video on social media.
I'm here because I don't have a future. And you might hate me for doing this, and you're entitled to hate me. But I wish you would direct all that anger and hatred at our government.
London has seen many demonstrations from the group recently. There have been over 650 arrests over the past few weeks. The Met says it diverts officers away from other duties.
We're not trying to win a popularity contest. We're not.
But you do need public support, though, don't you, for your cause?
We're not expecting everybody to love us. But yes, absolutely, the message is getting across. You're wrong on that count. The message is getting across.
The capital is seeing the effects of a warming climate with more extreme weather. Heat waves like we saw this summer that mean more wildfires. Flash flooding is also becoming more common.
A lot of these species, they're moving north.
At the Natural History Museum, they're monitoring how species are changing, and they now want to engage with Londoners.
We're shouting to different people now. So we did, historically, it was very much peer-to-peer. So we were talking with other scientists, we're talking about those involved in our sort of work. Now we're screaming to everyone. So now we're engaging with a youth audience, we're engaging with all sorts, and we're trying to get people to engage back with us and help us with our science.
Part of that is from tomorrow, they're hosting a climate cafe where people can come to talk about their anxieties.
I think we've recognized at this point in time that the instruments and the tools that we've expected to solve the climate crisis, the people in positions of power we've expected to solve the climate crisis, have not effectively stepped up to the challenge. And that's why it's so important that we bring back power in community and we create spaces in our own neighborhoods to have conversations about how this makes us feel and critically think about how we can collectively solve this crisis.
The government says it is taking action. Critics say not fast enough. Reducing emissions remains a huge challenge.
And Tom's with me now. And Tom, we saw in your report, no signs of any let-up in terms of the protests, and the police, it would seem, struggling to prevent those demonstrations.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's really, really difficult for the authorities. High court injunctions don't seem to work. Arrests before the protests don't work. Arrests during the protests don't work. Just Stop Oil keep coming back. And as we know, there's a lot of infrastructure that they can target. This is what the Metropolitan Police had to say a little bit earlier. Have a listen to this.
We need specially trained officers, and not only are they at height, but often they're glued on or locked on. So the officers have to get up to the top of the gantries with tools, able to either debond or cut the protesters off and then safely remove them. Which is a complex and difficult operation. Everybody has a right to protest, but this isn't protest, this is crime. The level of disruption they're causing is grossly disproportionate to any potential legitimate protest action that they may be taking.
Now, Just Stop Oil, they say they're going to carry on these protests until they get a meaningful statement from the government over these new oil licences. So I think it's very, very likely that these protests are going to continue.
OK. Tom, for now, thank you. Our environment correspondent, Tom Edwards. Well, joining me now is Professor Elizabeth Robinson, Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment from the London School of Economics. Very good of you to join us this evening, Professor. Bigger picture, because we have seen today, haven't we, just how strongly people feel about this issue, and whether you support the tactics or not, awareness about climate change, you could argue, has never been stronger. So what do we put this down to in terms of progress? Is it a lack of willpower? Is it a lack of action, money?
I think there's a frustration that there hasn't been action. So what we see is a lot of talk. We see countries coming together right now at COP27, talking about the commitments that need to be made. We talk about what nationally determined contributions, so how much each country needs to reduce its emissions. But I think it's that short-term action that shows we're actually on a pathway towards net zero by 2050 that sometimes leaves people frustrated, especially when we know there are actions that can be taken to ensure that it's more likely that we limit temperatures to below 2 degrees and ideally close to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels.
And we've heard from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at COP27 saying that he believes that we can summon the collective will, I believe are the words he's used, to deliver on the commitments made in Glasgow a year ago. But in terms of how the UK is doing on its climate targets, it has been criticised, hasn't it?
Yes, and so look, to some extent, the UK is reducing its emissions, but not fast enough. And part of why we're being criticised, I think, is because the UK needs to show global leadership. We did host COP26 last year, and we made commitments, and what we want to see is those put into action. It's not actually clear that the actions that will be taken are compatible. And I guess partly it's frustrating because there are actions that can be taken that will have direct benefits in the UK. So, for example, if we can decarbonise more rapidly our transportation systems, there's tremendous health benefits. We know that in cities in particular, for example, that heat and air pollution combined are particularly harmful to our health, and particularly so for people with pre-existing conditions, the elderly and the very young. So I guess it's quite frustrating when we don't see actions being taken that could be taken. We hear quite a lot about insulating homes, and there are so many benefits from that. We can reduce heating bills, people will be warmer in the winter, and we reduce our emissions and can contribute more closely to our nationally determined contributions.
And Professor, bring it right back to local and London and perhaps individuals themselves, because they see all of this happening. They see world leaders on the world stage talking, a lot of talking about climate change, and you're saying not enough action. But in terms of us individually, are there specific things, given the financial crisis that we are in? We've heard a lot of people struggling, inflation at a 40-year high. What can we do as individuals here in London?
Quite honestly, firstly, we need to let our local governments know that we want to see commitments to net zero. We want to see investment in low cost, low carbon public transport. But individually, those who can, it would be nice if people could take more public transport. Those who can switch to low carbon transport, can switch to electric vehicles. Those who could switch to renewable energy, invest in heat pumps where they can, invest in solar energy where they can. And of course, in London, we are lucky that we have direct train routes onto continental Europe, to all around the country. And so again, if we can, choose to take a train, not fly, where that's possible. And I say if we can, because not everyone can, but many of us really could make a greater contribution. Of course, more balanced diets can also help as well. And but really, we need to see governments, local governments, national governments, making that commitment we need. And it's very easy to tell people to walk and cycle more. It's very easy to tell people to take more public transport, but it needs to be affordable, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be safe.
Okay. A big topic, and we really appreciate you talking to us this evening. Professor Elizabeth Robinson, Director of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and Environment. Really appreciate your time. Thank you. Let's turn briefly to some of the day's other news.